Here is a question that sounds absurd until you understand how deeply Penang people care about their food. Who owns Char Kway Teow? Not owns the recipe, though that is contested too. Who owns the cultural identity of the dish? Who has the right to claim it as theirs? Who gets to decide what the authentic version is, where it should be sold, how much it should cost, and whether a hawker who has been making the same plate for 40 years should be allowed to keep their stall in the location where they have always operated? This is not a philosophical question in Penang, it is a political one. And the answers being given to it by politicians, by planners, by developers, by the tourism industry, and by the hawkers themselves are reshaping the city's food landscape in ways that are generating real conflict, real anger, and a genuine threat to the food culture that made Penang famous in the first place. This is the story of how Penang's street food became a political battlefield, and what is actually at stake in that fight. Penang's street food is not just food. It never was. It is the product of 2 centuries of migration, cultural collision, and the specific conditions that colonial Penang created: cheap land, dense populations, diverse communities, and a market economy that left the working poor to feed themselves. The hawker trade emerged from necessity and was refined into something extraordinary by generations of cooks who had nothing to work with except time and skill, and the specific ingredients available in this specific place. Today, that street food culture is one of the most valuable assets in Penang's tourism economy. The food guides, the travel features, the YouTube videos, the Instagram accounts, they all tell the same story. And the story drives visitors to Penang in numbers that have measurably transformed the city's commercial landscape. The paradox at the center of this story is the same one that haunts every discussion of Penang's heritage. The thing that made the city famous is being eroded by the fame. The economic value of the food culture is producing the conditions that destroy the food culture. And the political decisions being made about where hawkers can operate, how much they pay, what the regulatory environment looks like, and who benefits from the food tourism economy, those decisions are shaping the survival or the disappearance of a culinary tradition that the entire world has only recently discovered exists. This is the political battlefield. Let's go into it properly. 1. Where Penang's food culture came from. Understanding why Penang's street food became political requires understanding what it actually is and where it came from. Because the food culture that the world celebrates as Penang cuisine is not the product of a single community or a single tradition. It is the product of a very specific historical accident. When the British established Penang as a free port in 1786 and deliberately cultivated it as a trading hub, they created the conditions for one of the most diverse urban populations in Asia. Hokkien and Cantonese Chinese workers, traders and merchants, Tamil Indian laborers brought for the plantations and construction projects, Malay communities from the peninsula and the islands, Javanese, Achinese, Bugis, and dozens of other groups from across the archipelago. European administrators, Eurasian communities descended from colonial unions, all of them needing to eat, all of them bringing food traditions from their homelands, all of them interacting, adapting, combining and creating in a port city where the ingredients of the world flowed through the harbor and the cooking techniques of multiple civilizations were available on the same street. The Peranakan cuisine that resulted from the intermarriage of Chinese and Malay communities is the most studied and most celebrated product of this collision. But the hawker culture that evolved in the streets and 5-foot ways of Georgetown is equally significant. Hokkien noodle soup, whose prawn broth technique comes from southern China, applied to ingredients specific to Penang's coastal waters. Char Kway Teow, whose flat rice noodles and soy sauce base are Chinese, but whose cockles and sambal belacan are Malay. Nasi Kandar, whose curry traditions come from Tamil Nadu, adapted to the specific spice availability of the Penang marketplace. Rojak, whose sour, sweet, pungent dressing is a Peranakan synthesis of Malay, Chinese, and Indian culinary instincts applied to whatever seasonal fruit and vegetable the market offered. These dishes are not preserved traditions. They were never fixed. They evolved continuously as the communities that made them changed and interacted and adapted to each other and to the specific conditions of this specific place. The versions eaten today are the products of decades of individual refinement by individual cooks whose incremental adjustments accumulated into what the world now recognizes as the authentic Penang version of each dish. That process of continuous evolution, community-rooted, economically marginal, driven by individual skill in a competitive marketplace, is what creates great hawker culture. It is also exactly what the political and economic pressures now acting on Penang's hawker scene are systematically disrupting.
2. The relocation controversy. The most directly political issue in Penang's street food story is the question of where hawkers are allowed to operate. And the central controversy around this question has been the state government's program of relocating street hawkers from their traditional pavement and roadside locations into purpose-built hawker centers. The logic of the relocation program is not unreasonable on its surface. Street hawkers operating from the 5-foot ways of heritage buildings and the roadsides of Georgetown create congestion. Their operations are sometimes inconsistent with heritage conservation requirements. The hygiene standards of informal street operations are variable. A purpose-built hawker center with proper infrastructure, clean water, waste management, standardized stalls, regular inspections offers a more manageable environment from a public health and urban planning perspective. The opposition to the relocation program, however, is deep and substantive. The specific location of a hawker stall is not an incidental feature of its operation. It is constitutive of what the stall is. The Hokkien Mee uncle on New Lane has his customers because he has been on New Lane for 30 years. His regular customers know where he is. His reputation is specific to his location. His supply relationships, the fresh prawn supplier who delivers to that specific address, the noodle maker in the nearby lane, are built around his position. Moving him to a purpose-built hawker center 3 kilometers away does not relocate his operation. It dissolves the specific web of relationships and geography that made his operation what it is. There is also the economic dimension. Stalls in purpose-built hawker centers carry rental costs and operational overhead that informal street operation does not. For hawkers operating on thin margins, and the margins of hawker food priced at heritage market levels are genuinely thin, the difference between operating from a site that costs a few hundred ringgit per month in informal arrangements and operating from a purpose-built center charging current commercial rental rates can be the difference between viability and closure. The relocation program has been implemented selectively and has generated specific, documented controversies. Hawker stalls at specific locations that carry significant property value, land that developers or government agencies wish to redevelop, have faced relocation pressure that stalls at less commercially valuable locations have not. The pattern, as heritage advocates have documented it, suggests that the urban planning rationale for relocation is at least occasionally secondary to the commercial interest in freeing up heritage zone land for higher value uses. The hawkers who have been relocated and the stalls that have closed rather than relocate are among the most significant specific losses in Penang's food heritage over the past decade. They are not dramatic losses. No single event announced them. No ceremony marked them. They happened one by one, as individual stalls closed when their operators were faced with choices between relocation on unfavorable terms and retirement. The accumulated loss is substantial. 3. The hawker licensing battle. The traditional hawker license in Malaysia is issued by the local authority, in Georgetown's case, the Majlis Bandaraya Pulau Penang, the Penang City Council. A hawker license entitles the holder to operate from a specified location and in principle renewable annually. In practice, hawker licenses have historically been maintained indefinitely by families who passed them from generation to generation, a practice that gave the hawker trade a form of informal property right in the locations they occupied. The regulatory tightening of recent decades has challenged this informal inheritance. Licensing requirements have been strengthened, renewal processes made more rigorous, and the conditions attached to licenses made more prescriptive in ways that increase the compliance burden for small operators. a hawker uncle who has been making Char Kway Teow from the same corner for 40 years and whose business model has never included a formal accounting system or a food safety certification, may find that the renewal of his license now requires documentation and compliance that his 40 years of practice cannot produce. The halal certification question is a specific and politically sensitive dimension of the licensing environment. The Penang state government's approach to halal standards in food operation, the question of whether non-halal food, primarily pork-containing dishes, central to Penang's Hokkien Chinese food heritage, can be sold in public spaces, under what conditions and with what restrictions, has been a recurring source of tension between the state government and the Chinese community that produces and consumes much of the city's most celebrated hawker food. The specific political arithmetic of Penang, a state where the DAP-led government has historically relied heavily on Chinese community support, while governing a state with a significant Malay Muslim majority whose religious sensitivities around halal food are genuine and politically significant, means that the halal question is never simply a regulatory matter. Every decision about where non-halal food can be sold, what signage is required, what spatial separation from mosques or Muslim prayer spaces is mandated, is made against a background of communal politics that makes straightforward policy nearly impossible. The hawkers who operate in this political environment are not primarily political actors. They are small business owners trying to keep their operations viable in a regulatory and economic environment that is becoming increasingly unfriendly to them. The political dimension of their situation is one they did not choose or create, but it is the dimension that determines whether their operations survive.
4. What tourism did to the prices. The tourism economy that Penang's food culture helped create has had a specific and thoroughly documented effect on the economics of the hawker trade, and the effect is not the unambiguously positive one that tourism advocates typically describe. The increase in visitor numbers to Penang since the UNESCO heritage designation in 2008 and the international food media attention that followed has produced genuine economic activity in the city. More visitors spending money on food is, in narrow terms, good for food vendors. The hawker stalls at the most visited locations in Georgetown have seen demand that their previous customer bases could not have imagined. But the economic dynamics produced by tourism are more complex than simple increased demand. The increased commercial value of the heritage zone properties where the best-known hawker stalls operate has driven up rents for the coffee shops and covered spaces where hawkers set up. The increased land values have made redevelopment economically attractive in ways that threaten the informal arrangements under which many hawkers have historically occupied their spaces. And the price expectations of international visitors who are willing to pay for the hawker food experience at prices that reflect the experience's value to them rather than its production cost have created pressure for price increases that alter the fundamental character of what hawker food is. Hawker food is not upscale food served cheaply as an act of cultural generosity. It is food priced at levels that working people in the communities where it evolved could afford to eat every day. The affordability is not peripheral to its cultural meaning, it is central to it. When a bowl of Assam laksa that was priced for the daily consumption of a Georgetown office worker is repriced at levels that reflect tourist willingness to pay, the dish survives, but the culture that produced it, the culture of daily, affordable neighborhood food, is replaced by something different, by a performance of that culture, for an audience that visits and pays and leaves. The specific Penang food vendors who have navigated this environment successfully have generally done so by maintaining their original pricing while increasing volume, drawing both tourist and local customers through quality and authenticity rather than price adjustment. The vendors who have raised prices toward tourist market levels have generally found that they lose their local customer base and become dependent on tourist traffic that is inherently more volatile than the stable neighborhood regulars who sustained them before. The hawkers who have neither raised prices nor increased volume and who have simply maintained their operations as they always were, these are the ones whose existence is most precarious. They are operating on margins that the increased cost of doing business in a tourism economy is eroding.
Their stalls are the most authentic and the most financially fragile elements of the food landscape simultaneously. 5. The succession crisis as political issue. The succession crisis in Penang's hawker trade, the question of who will make the food when the current masters are gone, has been a subject of concern in the Penang food community for years. What makes it a political issue rather than simply a demographic one is the specific ways in which policy choices have shaped whether succession is possible. A young person in contemporary Malaysia who is considering a career in the hawker trade faces a specific set of disincentives that their parents' and grandparents' generations did not face to the same degree. The economic precarity of hawker operation, the thin margins, the uncertain licensing, the physical demands, the long hours, has always been a barrier to succession. What has changed is the cost of entry and the regulatory burden. Setting up as a hawker in Penang's heritage zone today requires navigating a licensing process that is more complex, more expensive, and less certain in its outcomes than it was for the generation who built the current food culture. The informal arrangements that allowed previous generations to simply take over a parent's stall and continue operating have been formalized and made contingent on compliance requirements that increase the cost and risk of succession. A hawker's child who wants to take over the family stall must now be a compliance-savvy small business operator rather than simply a skilled cook who knows the recipe. The culinary school route, the formalization of hawker skills through institutional training, has been proposed and partially implemented as a solution to the succession problem. The limitations of this solution are genuine. The specific skills that produce Penang's greatest hawker food are not primarily the skills that culinary schools teach. They are the skills produced by decades of daily practice in a specific commercial environment. The wok hay of the Char Kway Teow master, who has been firing the same wok at the same corner for 40 years, is not replicated by a trained cook whose experience is measured in months and whose practice environment is a culinary school kitchen rather than a heritage kopitiam. The government programs designed to address succession, competitions to identify promising young hawkers, subsidies for apprenticeship arrangements, documentation projects to record the recipes and techniques of aging masters are sincere attempts to address a genuine crisis. They are operating against economic incentives that are substantially more powerful than the programs designed to counteract them. A young person in Penang who can code, who can work in the expanding technology and financial sectors of the Malaysian economy, who can work remotely from the digital nomad community that has established itself in the city, that person is being offered a set of economic prospects that the hawker trade, however culturally significant, genuinely cannot match. The succession crisis will not be solved by documentation or competition. It will be solved, if it is solved, by making the hawker trade economically viable for the next generation, by addressing the underlying conditions of rent, licensing, and economic security that determine whether intelligent, skilled young people choose this path over the alternatives that an increasingly developed Malaysian economy offers them. That is a political problem, requiring political solutions. So far, those solutions have not arrived in a form adequate to the challenge.
6. What is being fought over and why it matters? The political battlefield that Penang's street food has become is, at its core, a battle about what kind of city Penang wants to be. And the stakes of that battle are higher than the usual terms of heritage versus development, authenticity versus commercialization suggest. Penang is a city that became significant in the world because of what its communities created over 2 centuries of coexistence and exchange. The food culture is the most immediately accessible expression of that creative coexistence. A daily, edible demonstration that Chinese and Malay and Indian and Peranakan culinary traditions can combine to produce something greater than any of them produces separately. The world's attention to Penang's food is, in a fundamental sense, attention to what happens when diverse communities are given the specific conditions, physical proximity, economic necessity, cultural openness, in which genuine exchange rather than parallel coexistence occurs. The political decisions being made about where hawkers can operate, how much they pay, who their successors can be, and what the regulatory environment looks like are not merely decisions about food.
They're decisions about what survives of the conditions that produce the food. A heritage zone that preserves the buildings but displaces the communities. A food scene that maintains the dishes at tourist prices but loses the daily affordability that made those dishes culturally embedded. A city that becomes famous for what it was rather than what it is. All of these are possible outcomes of decisions already being made. The people fighting for Penang's hawker culture, the heritage advocates, the food writers, the community organizations, the hawkers themselves, are fighting for something that goes beyond food. They are fighting for the specific conditions of cultural production that made Penang what it is. The food is the most visible evidence of those conditions. Its survival or disappearance will be the most legible signal of whether those conditions can be maintained. That is why a plate of Char Kway Teow in Penang is, at this specific moment in the city's history, a political object. Not just a beautiful thing to eat, an argument about what matters, who it belongs to, and what the city is for. The best Char Kway Teow in Penang still costs 8 ringgit. The uncle who makes it has been at his wok since before most of his customers were born. He has no successor. He does not plan to relocate. He will keep making it until he cannot anymore, and then it will be gone. That fact sits at the center of every political argument about Penang's street food. The politics is about whether the conditions that produced him, the affordable rents, the informal licenses, the specific geography of the heritage zone, the community of regular local customers who sustained him long before the tourists arrived, can be maintained long enough for someone to replace him, or whether the economics of the city he helped make famous will ensure that when he stops, nothing quite like him appears again. The argument is not over. The stalls are still there. The food is still extraordinary, and there are people in Penang who are fighting with genuine skill and genuine commitment to ensure that the next generation of that food culture gets the conditions it needs to exist. Whether they win depends on political choices that have not yet been made definitively, which means the outcome still depends on who pays attention, who shows up, and who decides that a plate of hawker food at the price a working person can afford is worth fighting to preserve. If this video added something, hit the like button, subscribe for more content that tells the full story of what is happening in Penang and Malaysia, and drop a comment below. What do you think is the most important thing that could be done to preserve Penang's hawker culture? Tell me. I read everything. See you in the next one.